Welcome back to the Judgment Files, everyone. Today we're going to be tackling a case that's considered like a landmark case in the U.S. Supreme Court, Gideon v. Wainwright.
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely one for the history books. And the sources you brought in are perfect for really getting into the details of this decision. We've got the syllabus from the Supreme Court itself and some really key excerpts from Justice Black's opinion, the one who wrote the majority opinion for the court.
Right.
Plus, we get to hear from Justices Douglas, Clark, and Harlan, too. They all wrote their own concurring opinions, and those are always fascinating to look at. It's amazing how much we can learn from just these few documents.
Yeah, totally agree. So for our listeners, the learner, our goal today is to unpack this really crucial issue, the right to have a lawyer, especially for those who can't afford one, when they're facing criminal charges in state courts.
Right, a fundamental concept, in American justice.
Yeah, exactly. And, you want to get all this info quickly and really understand it all. And maybe have a couple of aha moments along the way.
Absolutely. Always a good thing.
So with that in mind, let's just jump right in, shall we?
Sounds good to me. So let's start with setting the scene. Who is this guy, Clarence Earl Gideon? What was his story? And how did he end up in this, in this major Supreme Court battle?
Okay, so the story begins in Florida, right?
Yeah.
And Gideon is accused of breaking into this pool room. It seems like he, wanted to commit some misdemeanors in there.
I see.
But under Florida law, that breaking and entering was considered a felony. So not a minor offense at all.
Yeah, that definitely ups the stakes.
Right. So Gideon appears in court. And like many people in his situation, he didn't have the money to hire a lawyer. So he asked the court to appoint him one, which is totally, something you could do.
Makes sense. So what happened? Did they give him a lawyer?
No, they didn't. And this is where things get, interesting. The Florida court just flat out denied his request.
Wow. Just like that.
Yeah. They pointed to the existing Florida state law at the time. And this law said that you could only get a court-appointed lawyer if you were facing capital charges, those cases where the death penalty was a possibility.
So basically, unless you were potentially facing execution, you were on your own.
Pretty much. And the judge, he even told Gideon directly that he couldn't appoint him a lawyer for this kind of felony case.
Man, that's tough. I mean, facing a felony charge without legal help, I can't even imagine.
Exactly. So what does Gideon do? He's in this incredibly difficult situation, right? No lawyer, facing a felony charge. But Gideon, even without any legal training, decides to represent himself in court.
Wow, that's pretty brave.
It is. He went ahead and did everything himself. Opening statement, cross-examining the prosecution's witnesses, bringing in his own witnesses, even made his closing arguments. He did everything you'd expect a lawyer to do. And all the while, he maintained his innocence.
It's remarkable that he even attempted all that without any legal background. So I guess the next question is, did it work? Did he manage to convince the jury?
Sadly, no. Despite his best efforts, the jury found him guilty, and he ended up getting sentenced to 5 years in prison.
5 years? That's a long time. But even with that sentence, Gideon's story doesn't end there, right?
You're exactly right. While he was in prison, Gideon didn't just sit back. He started doing some serious legal research. And you know what? He actually drafted a petition himself, a petition for writ of habeas corpus, and he filed it with the Florida Supreme Court.
That's impressive. From prison, no less. So what was his main argument in this petition?
He basically said that his conviction was unconstitutional because, the trial court refusing to give him a lawyer. Well, that violated his basic rights under the federal Constitution.
Okay, that makes sense. So how did the Florida Supreme Court respond to Gideon's plea?
They denied it. They didn't even bother with a formal opinion.
Wow, that's rough. So what did Gideon do then?
Well, he was determined, so he took his case all the way up to the highest court in the land, the U.S. Supreme Court. And just the fact that the Supreme Court agreed to hear his case, granting what we call certiorari, that was a huge deal. It meant that the legal issues in this case were, really, really important.
I see. So the Supreme Court saw something significant in Gideon's case.
Absolutely. And the specific question they asked both sides to argue about, that's really telling too. They didn't just ask if Gideon's rights were violated. They specifically said, hey, let's reconsider our earlier decision in Betts v. Brady from 1942. And that's where things get really, really interesting.
Okay, so Betts v. Brady. That's the key to understanding why Gideon was such a game changer. Can you break down the Betts case for us a little?
Of course. So in Betts v. Brady, the court basically ruled that if a poor defendant, someone who can't afford a lawyer, was facing a felony charge in a state court, the court wasn't automatically obligated to appoint them a lawyer. They said it didn't automatically violate the 14th Amendment's due process clause.
I remember reading about their totality of the facts approach. Can you explain that a bit?
Yeah, so their reasoning was basically this. Due process is not just a rigid checklist, right? Yeah. So they said you have to look at each case individually. Did the lack of a lawyer make the trial fundamentally unfair? You had to consider all the specific circumstances.
Interesting. So they were saying the Sixth Amendment, which guarantees a lawyer in federal criminal trials, didn't automatically apply to the states.
Right. And that's why when the Supreme Court said, hold on, let's revisit Betts and Gideon, it was like a huge red flag. They were signaling that they might be ready to overturn that earlier decision.
That makes sense. So let's get to Gideon's arguments. What was his central point, and how did the court ultimately decide to overturn Betts v. Brady?
Gideon's argument was laser-focused on the Sixth Amendment. The one that says you have the right to a lawyer in all criminal prosecutions if you're in federal court.
Right.
So the big question was, is this right so basic, so fundamental, that states have to honor it too, through the 14th Amendment? And the court's answer was a resounding yes.
Unanimous, right. They all agreed.
Exactly. It was a total game changer.
Yeah.
Justice Black, who wrote the main opinion, he went back and looked at the history, just like the Betts court did.
Right.
But they came to a completely different conclusion. The Gideon court said, straight up, the right to a lawyer. That's a fundamental right. It's absolutely crucial for a fair trial. It doesn't matter if it's a federal or state court.
They really zeroed in on what actually goes down in a courtroom, the reality of it all.
Totally. They even brought up the Powell v. Alabama case from 1932, which was, a pretty intense case.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that one.
Right. So this case involved some black defendants who couldn't read, and they were facing these very serious charges, capital charges, in a super hostile environment.
Like stacked against them from the start.
Yeah. So in Powell, the Supreme Court had already said, look, these guys absolutely needed legal representation because of how extreme their situation was. And then the Gideon court took it further. They said, listen, needing a lawyer is just as crucial in other felony cases, even when it's not a death penalty case.
Because the law is complicated no matter what.
Exactly. And they even quoted Justice Sutherland from the Powell decision. And those words are powerful. Even the intelligent and educated layman has small and sometimes no skill in the science of law. He requires the guiding hand of counsel at every step in the proceedings against him.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement.
Right. So the Gideon court was saying this truth applies no matter what the specific charges are.
It makes you think about how much we take for granted when we think about the legal system, Like, we assume everyone knows how it all works, but it's incredibly complex.
For sure. And the court also pointed to something really interesting. How much the government invests in prosecuting cases. They spend a ton of money on prosecutors, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And people who can afford it always hire lawyers, So the court was like, this shows that everyone understands how important legal help is, but then you deny this to poor people. It totally undermines the idea of equal justice.
It creates a system where justice depends on how much money you have.
Exactly. And because of all this reasoning, the court came to a very clear conclusion. They basically said, Betts v. Brady. That was wrong turn. They called it an abrupt break from how things should be. And they declared that states have to provide lawyers to poor defendants in felony cases no matter what.
That's a huge shift, changing how the justice system works for so many people.
It was. And it's important to remember, the court was unanimous in this decision.
Right, a rare moment of complete agreement on a big issue like this.
Totally. But it's also really interesting to look at those concurring opinions, where the justices write their own thoughts about the decision. They add even more depth to the ruling. Like Justice Douglas, he really focused on the bigger picture of the 14th Amendment and the Bill of Rights.
Right. He's always been interested in that kind of overarching constitutional question.
Yeah. So Douglas brought up this long debate among justices about whether the 14th Amendment takes everything in the Bill of Rights and makes it apply to the states. And while the whole court hadn't adopted that full incorporation view, Douglas emphasized that Gideon was a big step towards it. It acknowledged that the Sixth Amendment right to counsel is super fundamental, and it said, yes, states have to respect this right too.
And Justice Clark had his own perspective, focusing on how the understanding of the right to counsel had been evolving, especially in the years leading up to Gideon.
Exactly. Clark pointed out that even before Gideon, the Supreme Court had been saying more and more that lawyers are necessary, especially in really serious cases, like death penalty cases or other big crimes. And for him, Gideon was just the next logical step.
It was like removing this arbitrary line between capital and non-capital felonies.
Exactly. Like, why should it matter if the death penalty's on the table or not? The right to a lawyer should be there regardless. And Clark even referenced Hamilton v. Alabama. That was a case where the court said, if you don't have a lawyer during a plea in a capital case, we don't even need to prove that you were harmed. It's presumed.
So they were already acknowledging how essential a lawyer is in those critical moments.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then you have Justice Harlan's concurring opinion. And he kind of offered a more nuanced view of overturning Betts.
Right. Harlan's always been known for his thoughtful approach to legal issues.
Yeah, he agreed that Betts had to go, but he wanted to be really precise about the history. He argued that Betts wasn't like a complete break from everything that came before. Instead, it was kind of an extension of these cases that focused on special circumstances when deciding whether someone needed a lawyer.
I see. So he's saying there was a line of thinking that led to Betts, even if it ultimately proved to be the wrong approach.
Right. But even Harlan admitted that this special circumstances rule had become a real mess. It was super hard to apply consistently. In reality, if the charges were serious enough, courts were basically already appointing lawyers.
So the practice was already moving towards the Gideon outcome even before the ruling.
Yeah, and Harlan made another interesting point. Just because the 14th Amendment says a right is fundamental, it doesn't mean every little detail of how that right works at the federal level automatically applies to the states. He pointed to Palco v. Connecticut to remind us that, hey, there's still a balance between federal power and state power.
So, while acknowledging this fundamental right to a lawyer, he was also respecting the idea that state and federal legal systems can still be different in some ways.
Exactly. So taking all of this together, what's the big takeaway from this landmark case?
Well, I think it's pretty clear. Gideon v. Wainwright established without a doubt the right to a lawyer for anyone facing felony charges in state court, even if they can't afford one. And this wasn't just a minor tweak to the system. This was a major change, overturning a bad precedent from Betts v. Brady. And it fundamentally made the American justice system more fair. It meant that your financial situation wouldn't automatically determine whether you could get a fair trial.
That's a huge step towards a more just system for everyone.
Absolutely. And I think it's a great reminder for us, as we think about the law and how it impacts our lives, it shows how the Constitution can be reinterpreted as our understanding of justice evolves.
And it raises some interesting questions for us to consider too, right? Like, what would happen in all those cases if people didn't have this guaranteed right to a lawyer? Would things have been different? And even with this right in place, what challenges still exist in making sure everyone can actually access legal representation, no matter their background?
These are really important things to think about, and I think this deep dive into Gideon v. Wainwright really gives us a good foundation to start exploring those questions.
Well said. It's a decision that continues to shape our legal system even today. And with that, we'll see you next time on the Judgment Files.